Hello and welcome to the I-24 News Evening Edition. I'm David Matlin and these are the headlines. A substantial German delegation led by Chancellor Angela Merkel arrives in Israel. On the agenda, the peace process and fragile relations between the EU and Israel. Egypt's military-backed interim government unexpectedly resigns, appearing to pave the way for a presidential run by the country's military strongman. An ongoing upheaval in the Ukraine. An arrest warrant is issued for the ousted president, Viktor Yanukovych, for the mass murder of protesters. Well, now we begin in the last hours. German Chancellor Angela Merkel arrived in Israel along with 15 of her cabinet ministers. Well, the first stop is Jerusalem and a dinner with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And tomorrow, new bilateral agreements are due to be signed. Well, while here, Merkel will also receive the Medal of Distinction from Israeli President Shimon Peres, the highest civilian honor in Israel. Well, amidst tensions between the two countries over the West Bank settlement policy. Now, joining me live from outside the Prime Minister's, we're going to a report about the relations between Israel and Germany. And actually now we are joined by Tal Shalev outside the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. Hi, Tal. Thanks for joining us now. What's on the agenda for this visit?
Well, good evening, David. You know, Jerusalem is very well used to high-profile visits, but even this visited city isn't used to seeing such a distinguished and wide-range visit as the German visit will be in the upcoming 24 hours. It's the fifth time that the Israeli government and the German government will be meeting for this kind of G2G, government-to-government consultations, but it's the largest bilateral consultation that the Israeli government has had in its history. There are three main topics on the agenda. The first is the Middle East peace process. The Chancellor has stated in interviews prior to her visit that she intends to lobby on behalf of the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and to pressure Netanyahu to take courageous decisions on the American Framework Agreement in the upcoming weeks. The other issue is the recent negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran that resumed last week in Vienna. Netanyahu intends to tell Germany and to the German Chancellor, which is one of the prominent members of the Six World Powers, that he does not believe the negotiations going on, and he intends to affirm his stand he expects from the West in these talks. And last but maybe not least is the bilateral dimension. Both governments are going to have a very wide joint cabinet meeting tomorrow morning. But even before that, all of the German ministers will be having one-on-one meetings with their Israeli counterparts, and there will be a signing of many bilateral agreements in a wide range of issues: education, economy, visa and consular services, and many more. And the Chancellor and the Israeli Prime Minister will officially launch the preparations for the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Germany and Israel, which will be marked next year.
Well, there have been recent reports of tension between Jerusalem and Berlin. How much of this will actually be addressed on this visit?
Well, Berlin hasn't been hiding its discontent with the Israeli settlement policy, and the German Chancellor has been repeatedly urging Netanyahu to freeze the settlement activity. Israel, from its point of view, is not very happy or satisfied with the stand that Germany has been taking in the international arena, specifically on the recent EU anti-settlement directives. But nevertheless, it seems like both leaders agree to disagree, and they do not intend to let these differences overshadow the visit. And just to make sure that is the case, the ending accord of Merkel's visit tomorrow will be a very special and distinguished ceremony at the president's residence, in which the Israeli president will be presenting her with a special...
Well, that's Tal Shalev reporting live from outside the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. And now, with a deeper look into the state of Germany-Israel relations, here's a report by Tal Shalev.
By all means, it is a festive demonstration of strong relations. No less than 16 German cabinet ministers are accompanying the Chancellor Angela Merkel on her visit to Israel. But the celebration, unfortunately, is overshadowed by reports of the worst crisis in years and of increasing tensions between Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Angela Merkel is a great friend of Israel, as is Foreign Minister Steinmeier, as is the entire government. I view this as an exchange between very, very good friends.
Since establishing diplomatic relations in 1965, Germany and Israel are considered to have what is called a special relationship, based on shared beliefs, Western values, and a combination of historical perspectives, with a focus on Germany's dark Nazi history and responsibility for the death of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. But in recent years, the air between Berlin and Jerusalem has changed, prompting several tense incidents, escalating even to harsh tones. Time and again, Berlin has expressed disappointment with Jerusalem's stand on the peace process and is growing increasingly critical about Israel's settlement policy, perceived as a barrier to peace efforts. Numerous Israeli governmental settlement construction announcements have been followed by furious telephone calls from the chancellor to the Israeli prime minister, and Merkel and her advisors deeply mistrust Netanyahu's commitment to a two-state solution. The Israeli government, for its part, is disappointed by Germany's low support for Israel in international forums.
Of course, we have talked about it, and I gave him my opinion on the question. In the end, we agreed on the fact that we do not agree on this matter.
To add to the rocky Netanyahu-Merkel relationship, many observers note that Germany's younger generation feels more at liberty and less guilt from the past to doubt the special relationship and criticize Israel. All of this helps explain why the prominent German newspaper Der Spiegel titled its article last week "Tensions Flare in German-Israeli Relations" and warned of a new low.
There is a gradual shift in the amount of responsibility that Germany feels vis-a-vis Israel. Like, I guess that naturally 30 years ago it was much more. But still, it's still there. There's still a very significant and very strong bond between the two countries.
Germany is still Israel's largest European trading partner, and the two countries have an extensive scientific and research relationship. Merkel has gone to great lengths in military cooperation and continued the delivery of highly sophisticated submarines to Israel. For all the distrust, Berlin declares repeatedly that Israel's well-being is one of its foremost foreign policy goals, and Jerusalem has been trying to weigh down the recurring points of tension, depicting them as a mere crisis in the family. Both sides hope that the festive visit can lift ties out of the nadir.
And now with our continuing coverage of events in the Ukraine, joining me now live from Kiev is Boaz Bismuth, foreign news editor for Israel Hayom Daily. Thanks for joining us here. What's the feeling on the streets right now of Kiev?
Good evening here from Kiev, where you can see behind me, you can hear still the crowd. They're not ready to leave here, the square, until they will be able to trust, as they say, the politicians. Right now, what is very, something that is very odd here in Ukraine is, although, they have succeeded in ruling out the president, you do not see any scene of joy. You do not see anyone chanting or anyone dancing here in the square. On the contrary, you see them still mourning their death, and especially being very worried of tomorrow. Worried of tomorrow again because of two reasons. First reason, of course, is the fact that Ukraine nowadays have no leader, and the second reason is, of course, they do not know how Russia will react, and they all know here that Russia is going to react, whether in a military way, economical way, or in another discreet way as the Russians can.
Well, just a few days ago, or in the last few days, it looked essentially like a civil war in the place you're standing now. Is there still a lot of anger towards the security forces?
No, I can't. From what I heard I heard the word civil war, and that is the last thing Ukrainian wants. You must understand one thing. Right now we have, if you're here and you can feel it, we have two nations with one flag. But on one side, one thing that both sides agree upon is that they do not want to see a division of their country. There can be people living in Lviv, of course, very nationalist, or the other ones in Kharkov. They want Ukraine to stay united. Yet at the same time, the eastern part, of course, do not agree and do not accept what has happened. And what worries especially the western part of the people here in Kiev is the reaction of the people in Crimea, of course those who prefer to be today allied to Russia. So again, I would say that the situation is very, very complex, and that is the reason why behind me you do not see any scene of joy after 2 days where Yanukovych again has become from president someone who is running away.
Well, thank you very much. Boaz Bismuth reporting from the streets of Kiev. Well, the new Ukrainian authorities have put missing President Yanukovych on the wanted list for suspicion of involvement in the mass killings during the protests in Kiev. Well, meanwhile, EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton visited Kiev today to discuss the country's future. Well, I24 News reporter Uri Shapira has more.
The wheels of justice apparently grind quickly in Ukraine. Only 3 days after he was ousted from office as president, Former leader Viktor Yanukovych is facing criminal charges by authorities for mass murder of dozens who were killed during the protests. In the meantime, Yanukovych's luxurious lifestyle is being revealed. Today, his winter mansion was exposed to the public, with a fancy car collection raising more claims of corruption.
It's a remarkable situation when the most sought-after character in the country is the president of Ukraine, who is hiding and doing everything to leave the country to avoid responsibility. I would like to underline that hundreds of victims are the responsibility of Yanukovych, who gave the order to disperse protesters.
Сотни жертв, которые сегодня есть, эти жертвы ответственности Януковича, который давал приказ.
The transition of power also seems to unfold quite fast in Ukraine. A day after he was elected as interim prime minister, Alexander Turchinov has already spread statements regarding his new agenda towards EU membership and against the long-lasting pact with Russia.
На правній і добросусідській основі.
Equal and goodwill basis, which recognizes and takes into account the European choice of the country. I hope that it is this choice that will be confirmed on the presidential elections on 25th of May of this year. We guarantee they will fully subscribe to the highest European standards, they will be liberal and fair.
It is still too soon to determine in which direction the country will go after May 25th, the date set for the country's presidential election. But after months of clashes and bloodshed, the city of Kiev is gradually returning to normality, though it might be the calm before the next storm.
Well, and moving on now, is the Syrian opposition extending a hand to Israel? Well, yesterday we aired an exclusive interview with a former general in Assad's regime who made a call to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But he's not the only figure in the Syrian opposition to seek a new kind of relationship with Israel. Well, here's a report from Matthias Inbar and Mael Ben-Oliel from Istanbul.
A luxury hotel in Istanbul. These men are Syrian, opponents of Bashar al-Assad's regime. In this great Turkish megalopolis, they fight their battle, away from the battlefield, away from their weapons. Here, it's about preparing for the political future, one that also takes Israel into account.
The regime has been distorting the situation for 40 years. It has presented Israel and the Jews as the enemies of the Syrian people, the only enemies. We know that it's a lie. There is no disagreement between us and the Jews. They are our brothers. Once we overthrow the regime, we will act to establish peace in Syria, in all countries around the world and in neighboring countries. We have suffered enough.
The semblance of dialogue originally started thanks to Mehdi Safadi, an Israeli from the Druze community and the former deputy director of the Ministry of Development of the Negev and Galilee, whether he's officially mandated by the Israeli government or not.
Measures should be taken in anticipation for the day Assad is dismissed. No Israeli has interest in having hostile and radical elements, terrorists, spreading along the frontier with Syria.
Although most rebel groups, especially those affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda, do not hide their animosity towards Israel, some others belonging to the Free Syrian Army tend to be more moderate.
The Syrian people, as a people of the world, need support from all the world. It needs the world to stand on its side. So we ask for the help of all the countries around this world, Western countries, United States, and even Israel. We need this help to expel this dictatorial and criminal regime, to establish the basis for a sustainable and comprehensive peace.
These declarations may confirm the claims of an Israeli military commander from the northern region, who claims some contacts have clearly been established between the IDF and the rebels. In the background, some 1,600 wounded Syrian soldiers and civilians treated in an Israeli hospital. But the IDF general staff is categorical. No direct intervention in the Syrian conflict is being considered.
And now to Egypt, where the interim prime minister announced the resignation of his cabinet, a surprise move that could be designed in part to pave the way for the nation's military chief to leave the defense minister post to run for president. Well, Hazem el-Bablawi's military-backed government was sworn in on July 16th, less than 2 weeks after Field Marshal Abdel Fattah el-Sisi ousted Islamist President Mohamed Morsi after a year in office. Well, the government's resignation was announced by el-Bablawi in a live TV broadcast. And joining me is Middle East analyst Ali Waked. Well, thanks for joining us here
Good
again.
evening, David.
So this latest development in Egypt, what's the reason behind it? I mean, was it expected?
It was expected. It was expected to be closest to the presidentials, but it came earlier since around General Sisi, there were some advisors who expressed their worriness from the fact that the only rival for the moment in the presidential, Hamdin Sabahi from the left Nasserist movement, will succeed to have around him all those who disagree with the regime, with al-Sisi. The current government didn't. It failed to deal with the difficulties at the economic level. At the security level, it is true that it was the army on which Sisi is responsible, but on the other levels of life, social, economy, it didn't answer to the expectations of the Egyptian people, especially to the young people. And what I heard this evening from my Egyptian sources, that the new government will include some young figures which this government didn't include, in a clear sign of Abdel Fattah Sisi towards the Egyptian youth, that I will take the youth into consideration, which we didn't make in the current government. And this expressed the fact that although everybody and the polls are assuming that al-Sisi will be elected to the presidential, he is worried to be facing a tougher campaign than he anticipated when he decided to go for the presidentials.
So you think there's actually a chance that a true rival can emerge against him? He's been such a dominant figure in the Egyptian political scene recently. You think there's a chance for someone to rival him for the presidency?
For the moment, there is no chance. But if Sisi wants first to see a growing number of Egyptians participating in the elections, the last referendum, the score was less than 33% of the Egyptians who went to vote, and al-Sisi want bigger numbers. He want to enjoy a bigger majority of the Egyptian people. And according to some reports in Egypt, Hamdin Sabahi is in contact with some moderate elements, even elements, Islamic elements who are close of the Muslim Brotherhood, to gain their support in the elections. And Sisi want to cut the road over any chance of a huge surprise in the presidentials.
Well, you mentioned the security situation a little bit being a factor. What about the economic situation in Egypt? What's the status today?
The direct reason of this resignation was the fact that the government didn't succeed to deal with dozens of strikes that hit Egypt in the last month, both in the private and in the public sector. The government that promised to create jobs failed totally in this issue. And we are hearing that once again there is a chance that some businessmen from the sector, from the private sector, those businessmen that were one of the reasons that the Mubarak regime collapsed, because of its relations with the private sector, and the fact that some private businessmen were part of the government, seem to be part of the next government, in order to try to encourage the creation of more jobs, and at least to launch a financial campaign that can be presented in the elections by General Sisi team.
So they're out to win over the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people a little bit, talking about putting bread on the table and, of course, securing the state for everyone to live.
Of course, the two issues are going together, the social, economic, and, of course, the security issue.
Makes sense. Well, again, thank you very much, Ali Waked.
Thank you, David.
And coming up on this evening edition, the author of the new book, Prisoner X, and the new revelations on the Israeli spy story gone wrong. And after her recent passing, the story left behind by Alice Hertzsummer, a Holocaust survivor and the world's oldest pianist. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the evening edition. Now, the case of Prisoner X exploded onto the Israeli scene in early 2013, a captivating story of secrecy, espionage, and ultimately death. Well, now a new book by an Australian journalist provides a new insight into the ordeal. I-24 News correspondent Charles Biblazea reports.
December 15th, 2010. Prisoner X is found hanging in his cell at Israel's Ayalon prison. And then silence. A gag order imposed for years, which, when finally broken, sets off a media frenzy. Who was this man, and why were the details of his death kept secret? According to the prevailing narrative, Ben Zigir was a dual Israeli-Australian national and alleged Mossad agent. In 2008, he reportedly had unauthorized dealings with a Hezbollah associate, which ended up exposing 2 Israeli assets, thereby landing Zigir in prison. But now, a bombshell has been dropped, in the form of a new book written by Australian journalist Raphael Epstein, who argues that Zigir was in fact charged with espionage and treason for passing classified information to an Iranian businessman.
It was this Iranian who played a key role in his downfall. Put simply, Ben said too much to the wrong person at the wrong time. He got into trouble because he just didn't know when to shut up.
The ordeal raised many questions, foremost of which was how Israel could incarcerate someone in total secrecy and then keep his death under wraps. Overall, Epstein's book adds a new twist to this quintessential Israeli spy saga.
Well, joining me now is the author of the new book, Prisoner X, Raphael Epstein. Well, thanks for joining us here tonight. First, what were the main revelations from your new book on Prisoner X?
I think there are a few important new things. Firstly, I couldn't find anyone to corroborate the previous stories that Ben had somehow dobbed in or had arrested some double agents who were working for Israel in Lebanon. What I was told is that he'd given information away about his work against Iran when he was working for Mossad, and that he'd given up information. I don't know if it was advertent or inadvertent. No one told me what his motives or his lack of care may have been, but that he gave that information up while he was studying at a university here in Melbourne. The person he was telling that to had strong connections to Iran. The information got back to Tehran, and once Tehran knew about it, Israel found out about it as well. And it's whatever Ben said about his work while he was working in Europe targeting Iran, whatever he said got back to Israel, and that's the reason he was charged, and that's the reason he was in a jail cell in your country.
So does this actually imply that he wasn't a major agent? Do you think the story was exaggerated?
I don't think either the previous stories or my story say too much about his seniority. He is not, or he was not at the elite level of Mossad. He's not someone who's involved in physically, perhaps, if the claims are true, physically targeting Iranian scientists in a big Iranian city. But he was certainly part of that multifaceted approach. Under Mir, Dagan, the Mossad were the go-to people for every bit of information on Iran. And Ben was part of that. The journalist who was working for an Australian newspaper was initially told that Ben had been travelling to Iran on his Australian passport. Other people told me that Ben had been travelling to Iran on his Australian passport. Was he the most senior person? No. But the operation he may have given up details about involved another more senior Australian who also lived in Italy, worked at the same company that Ben worked for. So if he gave up those sorts of details, you can imagine a scenario under which Mossad would say that you've given up too much information and you need to face some charges. I should say, too, that there's a lot of revelations in the book, in Prisoner X, about him being followed on the streets of Melbourne in his final year when he's living in Australia. He's being physically trailed and having his phone calls listened to by Australian intelligence as well.
Well, thanks for being with us, Raphael Epstein. And today is the beginning of what's been dubbed Anti-Apartheid Week by the supporters of the BDS movement to boycott Israel. Well, here's an excerpt from I-24 News Inside Magazine on the controversial issue.
For nearly 10 years, pro-Palestinian activists have gathered around the world with a common goal, fighting what they call Israel's colonization policy, a campaign called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions.
I call everybody to ban all products from Israel. I let my family and my friends know about it. I solicit stores and supermarket managers. I tell them not to buy those products in the wholesale market. If we stop buying products which grow on colonized lands, we'll stop keeping the system profitable.
They advocate a boycott of products, in addition to a cultural, academic, scientific, and athletic boycott. One of their actions, possibly the loudest and the most aggressive, is a raid on superstores, where a handful of people work to convince the consumers.
In this store, you eat Israeli apartheid. Indeed, Oshan distributes products from the Mahadrin brand.
Another objective, trying to convince artists not to perform in Israel. Groups pushing the BDS movement are well dispersed via the web and social networks, a refined communications apparatus whose impact will come to the forefront this week.
Now, South Korea's defense ministry announced the start of the U.S.-South Korean annual joint military drills today. Well, despite protests from Pyongyang, the yearly defense exercises are scheduled to last from February 24th to April 18th. According to the U.S. command in South Korea, over 5,000 participants from both countries will take part in the computer-assisted war games simulation exercise. And now, with the overwhelming support of local politicians, Uganda's president signed into law a highly controversial anti-gay bill that allows harsh penalties just for being homosexual, despite all the international outcry. Y24 News reporter Eli Ochenberg has the details.
This is a historical document.
Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni signed an anti-homosexuality bill Monday, confronting protests from Western donors and U.S. President Barack Obama. The final bill has not yet been published, but according to drafts of the legislation, the new law will punish people convicted of having gay sex with jail terms up to life. It will also make it a crime to promote gay activity and to fail to report someone for breaking the new law.
We shall have a war with the homosexual lobby in the world.
Homosexuality is taboo in almost all African countries and illegal in 37, including Uganda, where rights groups say gay people already risk jail. Gay and lesbian organizations in Africa fear the ripple effect from the anti-gay bill could spread beyond Uganda to other parts of the continent where conservative societies tend to view homosexuality as unnatural. The anti-gay bill was first introduced in 2009 and initially proposed a death sentence for homosexual acts, but was amended after an international uproar. Donors have threatened to cut aid if the bill goes into law, and U.S. President Barack Obama warned earlier this month it would complicate relations with Washington, calling it a step backward for all Ugandans. But while African leaders broadly court Western donors with promises to tackle human rights abuses, many have taken a hardline stance against homosexuality, describing it an un-African behavior.
Well, now coming back to the topic of the anti-apartheid week, it's something we'll be touching on throughout the week here. Joining me now is Giddy Greenstein, president and founder of the Root Institute and author of Flexigidity. Well, hi, thank you for joining us here tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
So tell us more about this anti-apartheid week.
Well, first of all, this is an organization, like a global trend of events where Israel is being framed as an apartheid state by the so-called BDS movement. This is a movement that calls for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. In its essence, this is a movement that tries to single Israel out and demonize Israel and delegitimize Israel. Their ultimate goal is to bring down the political and economic model of Zionism and the State of Israel. The ultimate vision is that there would be no State of Israel. So this is basically a set of events that are part of a much bigger scheme to challenge the very existence of the State of Israel.
Well, this campaign now, this boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, taking a look at Europe and the United States, where is it stronger? Where does it have the most momentum?
Well, we see it primarily in liberal circles in Europe and also across many campuses in the United States of America. The anti-apartheid week and that idea of apartheid being framed in the context of Israel is, as I said, an initiative of the BDS movement, but it also brings in a lot of other people who do not fully embrace or understand the motivation of the BDS movement. Many of them are critical of Israeli policies, but in essence, they are part of a bigger picture here, of a bigger movement here, initiative that is radically anti-Israel. And the test of that is that the BDS movement actually does not support the principle of two states for two people. It does not support the two-state solution. It wouldn't support any motion that would, in one way or another, enshrine the right of the Jewish people to self-determination and the right of the state of Israel to exist. So basically, we're looking at a lot of events initiated by a movement that is radically anti-Israeli, with the participation of many others that are critical of Israeli policies, not necessarily anti-Israel per se, but that's what we're looking at, and that's the challenge that our side needs to respond to. And when I say our side, I'm talking about the state of Israel, the government of Israel, as well as Jewish communities all over the world.
Well, speaking of that, Gidi, what's being done to combat this? I mean, what's the state of Israel doing? Who's fighting this movement?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of movements, student movements and student and Jewish organizations that are trying to confront the BDS movement and the anti-apartheid week on the ground in campuses. I'm talking about groups associated with AIPAC in the United States, Stand With Us, and a lot of other pro-Israel groups.
Well,
but in essence, in essence, the way to combat the BDS movement is to try to drive a wedge between those that are delegitimizers and those that are critical with Israeli policies. And the delegitimizers usually pretend to be, put up a face of being a human rights group, people that support international law, where in fact they're just about criticizing and isolating and demonizing the state of Israel. So exposing their true face usually compromises their ability to operate.
Well, Gidi Greenstein, thank you for joining us here tonight. Now, the extraordinary life of Alice Herz Sommer, that is, came to an end yesterday at the age of 110. But the amazing story of the Holocaust survivor and the oldest pianist in the world lives on in a documentary nominated for the upcoming Oscars. A report from our culture correspondent Shachar Peled on the woman who's become an inspiration.
Heaven just got a little better. It's only one of the many thoughts posted about 110-year-old Alice Herz Sommer, believed to be the oldest known pianist and Holocaust survivor who died yesterday in London.
Every day in life is beautiful. Every day. It's beautiful.
A documentary film, The Lady in Number 6, followed Herz Sommer's extraordinary optimistic outlook on life and has become the leading nominee for an Academy Award for Best Short Documentary at the Oscars next week. In 1943, the Nazis sent Herz Sommer and her young son to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where inmates were used for propaganda purposes in an attempt to show the world how well the Jews of Europe were being treated. A pianist and musician from Prague, she endured the ordeal partly through her passion for music, as many other survivors of the camp who were part of its orchestra.
I can say without hesitation that the cello saved my life, because I knew what was going on in Auschwitz. So I became a member of this orchestra, which was completely life-saving, because as long as they wanted music, they couldn't put us in the gas chamber. I mean, you know, there's a certain amount of logic in the Germans.
I knew that we will play. And I was thinking, when we can play, it can't be so terrible. The music.
Following the war, she lived in Israel for 40 years, teaching music in Tel Aviv before moving to London. Those who met her had the chance to discover her inspirational stories and her famous refusal to bear any grudges.
Even in the short period I met her, despite the fact it was hard for her, she went to the piano, she played for us, and she spoke about the power of music to save people's life, like her story, and to bring people together.
As the world continues to lose the remaining survivors of the Holocaust, Herz Sommer's views on how to live a long and happy life, despite the atrocities endured, are a lasting reminder for generations to come.
With me now is the host of the I-24 News magazine, The Two, Jason Danino-Holt. Jason, great to have you back here.
Thank you very much, David. So my first topic is the world's buzzing now about Barcelona. There's the annually mobile convention there. It's a big expo with everything that's happening now in the mobile world.
Most important thing in the world these days, the newest cell phones, right?
The newest cell phone. Yeah. By the way, Apple is not going to be there because their style is never to do expos with other companies. So the biggest company that everybody's talking about is Samsung with two things. First of all, you have the watch, the smart watch. That's something that everybody's trying to tap and have the first good, efficient, that sells amazing.
Apple's also got a watch, right?
Nothing that really got successful yet. They want to sync everything, your music, your la la la. So Samsung had launched one 6 months ago. It didn't sell well at all. And now, in a rare move, they're launching a new one. So we're going to see exactly what's going on there. And you also have the Galaxy 5, which is the new phone everybody's expecting. They're doing a huge launch party tomorrow. And at the Tube, we're going to show, this evening, we're going to talk to an Israeli journalist that's there. Tomorrow, we're going to show what's happening in the Samsung big event. And, we have 170 Israeli startups also in the convention. Yeah, so we're going to have Barcelona
what else
week.
you got for us here today?
Yeah, have you heard of Neck Nominate?
No, I haven't heard about it. Tell us about it.
Well, it's a really disgusting web phenomenon of people getting extremely drunk. And then they film themselves doing stupid things while they're getting drunk. And then they name 2 people that need to do the same in the next 24 hours. Sadly, 5 people died from this Neck Nominate. So now a person from Johannesburg, South Africa, decided to take that and give it a positive twist. What he does is he films himself after he was nominated, giving food away to homeless people and nominating 2 people to continue the tradition.
Trying to clean it up a little bit, the concept.
Exactly, clean it up a little bit, raise awareness of the fact that it's a very dangerous game, and we have world issues, so maybe we can address them.
Great, well, what's next for us?
What's next for us is, I have a feeling me and you share that when we were kids, I always fantasized about being able to jump on a wall and do the loop thing.
Bruce Lee style moves, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, now, thank God, there's Pepsi and a new commercial, because they took a runner called Damian Walters, and, well, he actually did it. Let's take a look, and then we'll talk about it.
Well, I suppose that's amazing, right? I mean, stayed on his feet.
Yeah, each one and his dreams.
Great. Well, thanks for being here again, Jason. Interesting as always.
Okay, thanks.
And coming up after the short break here, the Daily Debate. Don't go anywhere.